Welcome to Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Michael Dwyer. Our guest today, no stranger to this show, is Tom Giffen, who is the president of the Vermont Old Cemeteries Association. Our topic this morning is saving Evergreen Cemetery. And there's a lot that Tom will tell you about this. He probably knows more about this cemetery than any other living person. And we are vastly aided this morning in this presentation by video footage of the cemetery that was filmed by Jim Boughton on Monday. We had 43 minutes worth of film, which we have edited down to 26 minutes. And at some points, Jim had to speed up the video, so I don't want you to think that I was driving recklessly through the cemetery. And there's one other personal note that I have to make here. I've known Tom and his wife, Barbara, for many years. And Barbara told Tom this morning that I would be wearing a tie. So apologies to you, Barbara, had I known if I had received the phone call, even in this humid weather. So let's talk about this topic that I know you have a great deal of passion and enthusiasm for, saving Evergreen Cemetery. So as we look at what the challenge is, where do we go from here?
Well, the cemetery again has been around. The burials from the late 1700s. It's a very large part of the Rutland City property. It's 44 acres. It's all in the city. None of it's in the town, and it's something that everybody in this area and beyond have people buried in Evergreen, including myself. Mm-hmm. It has a history of people who were Medal of Honor award, who got the award for Medal of Honor. There are poets. There's Revolutionary War soldiers. There's a dichotomy of so many people that are buried there that are so important to the history, and not only Vermont but the United States. The history of Vermont is the history of the United States. You can't talk about Roberts Rangers, Ethan Allen, or any of the history without talking about Vermont. And the people who made all this history are buried in Vermont Cemetery. And Evergreen, a beautiful garden cemetery, is where many of them are buried. And for that reason alone, we should preserve it. The issues we have, again, Evergreen in its history was very financially solvent. And over the years, in fact, people would got their house mortgages from loans from Evergreen.
Wow.
And in fact, one of my relatives got his first loan for his first house from Evergreen. Mm-hmm. So what's happening over the years, things change. Now, over 95%, I've heard, of people in Vermont are now cremated. So with cremations, you don't necessarily need a plot. You don't necessarily need to even have a burial in a cemetery. Mm-hmm. So when a cemetery depends on the income from burials, that cuts into your fund. So what's happened is the money has dwindled over the years, and so Evergreen, as you very well published all over, was financially insolvent, and they were going to dissolve the board and close the cemetery. And again, I'm also president of the Vermont Old Cemetery Association. I deal with hundreds of cemeteries. I've never seen or heard of a cemetery or association this large from becoming basically bankrupt. It's kind of unusual. The state law is very clear about cemetery associations. If association dissolves, the municipality may take it over. It does not say shall take it over. And so the city does, for obviously the taxpayers do not need to have another burden upon them. So what happened was there was a group of people, interested men and women, called Friends of Evergreen Cemetery, that decided to take over, make a new board. Some very great people are on it, a lot of energy, and we have reestablished the board with the bylaws, and now we're in the process of keeping things going. The challenge is a lot of it is financial, obviously. People like to see a mowed cemetery, like to see it look that way. There's issues with trees in the cemetery, but the big thing now is just to continue having an operation, which it is, and get us on a financial footing. And we've been very fortunate with lots of donations. People have been helping. A lot of volunteers willing to step up to help with mowing and other general maintenance work. So I believe we're on the right track. I'm very proud of what the board's doing, and I think you'll see it continue. And maybe in a couple of years, I think we'll be fine.
Excellent. So let's watch some of this video footage. And I will tell you, having made many trips there myself looking for individual graves, the 43 minutes that Jim and I were there, it was just astounding to me how vast it is. In places that I thought, oh my goodness, am I going to break my axle by going up this steep hill? A funny thing, there were many walkers in the cemetery
Yes.
when we were filming. And as we went around the second time, I think these folks will be in the film, we just assured them that there was no criminal intent on our part by going around. So since you know far more than I do, feel free to comment on what we're seeing here.
Well, what you're seeing again is one of the newer parts of the cemetery, somewhere in the mid-1800s, and you see one of the issues we have are these red pine trees that have died. Now, trees don't belong in cemeteries. The unfortunate part was Vermonters love trees, and I love trees myself, but when you see like that one right there with the red pine, that's ready to fall over. When those trees fall over, they can do some terrible damage to the monument. So one of the things we'll be doing is hopefully be taking out the dead ones that come along. But as you can see, it's a very well-maintained cemetery. It's not. I go to a lot of cemeteries in the state of Vermont. This is a garden cemetery. I mean, the road notwithstanding, you look around, the stones aren't knocked over, things are clean. It's a beautiful place, has a lot of serenity in it when you walk through it. One of the issues in Vermont cemeteries especially is that we bury people on the hill. You can see some of the stone. Gravity is not our friend. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of things what we'll do is we'll hit different parts of the cemetery, do some stone straightening, and again, that tree there should be removed, it's dead, and do some just general cleanup as you go along. But if you walk through, one of the nice things about Evergreen is I go in a lot, obviously, and the wildlife that's there. I mean, there's a family of ravens that are over on the other side. There's turkeys. There's fawns. In addition to being a very nice cemetery with hydrangea bushes, and it also is a haven for wildlife, and it's always fun to see what is there. But again, you see these large white pine trees. They're okay for now, but those of us who live in Vermont for any length of time, the wind we've had, look how tall they are. Mm-hmm. But again, it's Evergreen Cemetery.
Yeah, this is where it got a little scary.
Oh, yeah.
going up in the car. But in the first section that we saw, I was struck by the number of obelisks and how that was just a very popular feature. I mean, that culminated in the Washington Monument, completed in 1883. But it's such a change in American culture as we go through the years of the Civil War, because I think that people confronted with the enormity of death on such a large scale, I think that when you look at the purpose of these monuments and how people regularly visited the cemetery, it actually helped them cope with their loss. And I think that, as we know, there are generations of people that would tell you, this is my family plot. I am the 6th generation to be buried here. But when we were up at this height of the cemetery, as you're saying here, this is where hills are not, the gravity starts to take effect on some of this.
No, you're absolutely right. It was very important for people, especially the Civil War era, even later, to have a monument made in a cemetery. A lot of times you'll see in memory of, because in the Civil War, a lot of them that were killed never came back. Mm-hmm. But it was important to the family that there was something to remember the deceased, and they have a stone in there. Mm-hmm. And when you walk even through Evergreen, when I take tours of like middle school and high school kids to the cemetery, I say, who's the richest person in the cemetery? Well, you can tell, because the monoliths, like you just talked about, they want to make sure it was they're remembered. I always get a chuckle, and I go to several places where I won't mention, where they're very, very, very large monuments, and the people the family's long deceased. There's nobody left, but the town's even named after them. But the monument is, it's the only thing that's left to them. But it was important, and even today, it's not as much as it was, but people of, I'll use my generation, still want to have a monument. So newer people couldn't care less. We have the green burials. You have, scattering of ashes, but as you look at these stones here with the different colored granite, those were not cheap.
When my grandmother, to whom I was very close, was nearing the end of her life, she said, "I'm going to put you in charge of my funeral." And I said, "All right, Nana, what do you want?" And she said, "Well, I want to be cremated and my ashes scattered over the Everglades." And I said, "Oh, I don't like that." Well, the long and the short of it is I persuaded her to her remains to come back to the family plot in Massachusetts. So when I went to the cemetery, they had dug the hole, but the park department put this sign over Nana's hole, and it said, "Do not enter." But I'm very happy that there is a monument to my grandmother with her parents and how her wishes were conveyed that way. Now, what do we see in the hillside
here? That tree's a mausoleum there has some issues. When they were going by, the wall is starting to cave in. Because, again, it's the maintenance that needs to be done all the time.
Now, is this a mausoleum or is this a storage?
That's a vault.
A vault, okay.
But again, even though the legislature tried to pass a law saying that we had to have burials every month of the year, which is ridiculous because some we can't get through. So it's just like in the old days, we had to have vaults to keep people till the ground can be worked. But again, you can see the different styles of monuments. You see the giant marble one. And you also, one thing you should look at, people think all their stones are dirty and they look gray. What's happening is with acid rain and with the environment, the marble has been discolored. You can, again, that you can clean it with a process called D2. You see the one on the left there, that's the Chaffee Monument, a very large piece of orange granite, again, their family plot.
So in this section here, which we saw on the left, which isn't mowed quite as well, how do you allocate the maintenance resources in the cemetery? Because of my recent trips there, I know volunteers, they probably take their family stone and then they mow all around it. So how does the need get met for when the grass starts to grow over monuments like here?
Grass is being very important to people who have family buried there. It doesn't hurt the cemetery or the stones, but it does cause the eye appeal. We call it curb appeal.
Okay.
They used to employ, back in the day, 12, 13, 14 people to maintain the cemetery. So now what we're doing is kind of curb appeal. We're trying to maintain, we're trying to keep the newer parts of the cemetery mowed, and we're having a volunteer day on on July 13th, on Saturday, with volunteers coming with lawnmowers and all kinds of equipment to mow the other parts of the cemetery. Right now we're trying to keep the places where it's still active and people drive to make it look nice. Our goal is obviously eventually to take it all over again and do the mowing and the maintenance. Again, it's a lot of it has to do with money, volunteers, and we hope to have another volunteer day this year where we'll do like stone repair and clean things up.
One thing that occurred to me on the hillside where you see the grass, that actually prevents further erosion. So when you have some of the heavy rainstorms, because certainly the grass growing here is not as invasive as the tree trunks that are going to uproot stones.
Yep. The issue with grass is eventually, if you don't keep it up, then trees start growing into it, and people get upset about it. But you did take the scenic route there. That I usually walk that. I don't drive my car, so yeah, that is a little more disconcerting.
Well, I would not have gone with Jim had I not been there before, and it was my search for the grave that I was telling you about. I know the car could make it. Now, what are we seeing right in front of us? That obelisk?
That's the Chaffee Monument for the Chaffee family. That whole area is their family plot.
Right.
You had mentioned about family plots. They have a family plot, and there is a lot of family plots in Evergreen. But you also can see the people who had more affluence and people, as opposed to people who just have a very small stone. You tell where they were in life, as it were.
Now, there's a section of the cemetery that I know that we did not get to, and at least on Peggy Jenks' map, it's called Flanders Field. Does that have anything to do with World War I?
I think there's a lot of World War I stones. I don't remember seeing that in Peggy's book. I'll have to go look. But
Okay.
I would say there's certainly lots of World War I veterans in that cemetery. And what's neat about, again, Evergreen is you have all the colonial wars, you have the newer wars, and you get up to the present day, people being buried there. It's still an active cemetery. People are still being buried there. And it's a lovely spot. And it's that's why I said that there's no way that people are getting concerned about it being abandoned into these large trees here. It's like it can't happen, and it won't happen. But if we hope that people will donate and to the cause, and we do have a restricted fund that will be used for perpetual care, because a lot of things will also happen even in Evergreen. It's supposed to be perpetual care funds, and people in not just for Evergreen, other places have used the perpetual care funding for maintenance.
And that's something that I think you can do a simple economic graph. So let's say in 1914 that someone bought a 14 grave lot for $200 in perpetual care. Well, even if that were invested at 7% over a century, probably 30, 40 years ago, you would start to lose money on that. So I think that's a little bit of a misnomer, that perpetual care doesn't mean forever care. The money runs out at some point.
I do a lot of cemetery restoration work. One of my favorite pictures I have for one of my slides is a very large monument we're lifting with a crane. It had fallen over, and on the bottom of the monument it said perpetual care. So yeah, unfortunately, there are cemeteries that invested wisely, and they do have a very large endowment, and they do provide perpetual care. And another thing we talk about is like power washing. Power washing is not a great thing for marble stones. It raises the grain, and the federal government on their military stones has prohibited no power washing. So if you want to clean a stone, the best thing is either use water and a brush, a plastic brush, or just a de-tilted dog. But again, the people like to see their monuments looking nice and white, but it's to keep the stones from deteriorating. Just water and a brush will be all you need. And
so in this area right here, which I had never been in before, as we were slowing down to make sure that I would get out again, I turned around and I recognized people that I know, because one of the things that kind of throws you, some people in my own family had their stone and their dates of birth on the stone before they passed away. So it's you can see that people are literally all over this cemetery, and I suspect that there are some people that probably chose a certain section of the cemetery where they wanted their family to be interred. But as the American way of death changes, you wonder if the generations that follow us will venerate on Memorial Day, Veterans Day, to the same degree that we do. I think that a lot of our civic and historical organizations with the flags, but I can remember in the years on my father's side of the family, I would go to the cemetery with my grandfather, and my grandfather said to me, I can't kneel anymore, but I want you to kneel and say a prayer for your grandmother. And when I came home with grass stains on my knees, my mother wasn't too happy, but my father said it was a good cause. But again, look at all the trees that we have here.
No, but what you said is correct, though. The cemeteries are becoming historical sites. And again, as a very mobile society that we have now, I have noticed around the state, and I'll use a place like Watertown, Vermont. I mean, it's very rural, but I go up there, but their cemeteries are in very good shape. They have the flags, they have interest in them, but the families have been there for generations. And then you go to Burlington, where like Greenmount Cemetery, or where Ethan Allen is buried. You think we're the best maintained cemetery in the state, and it's not. It's not because of the interest is not there. And then you have the thing where, do you buy textbooks for the kids for the school, or do you put money into a cemetery? It's a tough sell, but the years where people would come with the children it was all generational. We have great groups in Rutland that put out flags at Evergreen, which is wonderful, and they do an awful lot of work. But I look at an awful lot of white hair in a lot of them, and it's the years of Memorial Day where everybody goes to the cemetery. You don't see the crowds. I mean, you don't see it anymore. It's that generation, the baby boomers, and the greatest generation they have died out, and the cemeteries it's not as important as they once were.
One thing among many that I find fascinating are the number of statues, because we know the big difference between a Catholic cemetery and a Protestant cemetery, just in terms of the choices of monuments. You can certainly tell where the Irish are buried with the Celtic crosses. But some of the statues, we didn't linger long enough, and one of them, I suspected a female depiction might have been the personification of Columbia.
I know what you're talking about.
As the emblem of America. But the other statues, I will, on another trip back, I mean, this is just really scratching the surface of everything that we associate with the cemetery. There's so much more here.
The statue, what happens again, depending how affluent you were. If you knew we're the Marble Valley, there were artisans that were in Rutland County that worked for the marble quarries, and if you want to pay them, this one you're talking about right here?
Yes.
Yes, that's quite the statue there, and they paid a lot of money to have that put up there, so that and again, you see the steps walking up in there, the borders around their family. It is quite impressive. But I always often wonder what if you invest that money in the scholarship program for kids over the years, how many kids go to school. But it certainly is impressive. But again, even in cemeteries, I call it's cultural geography, and you'll see the people who have the money to make a monument that big. Remember, we didn't have They didn't have cranes and things. You put that all up by hand, which always amazes me. But
and another sociological thing, as we know, in Catholic cemeteries where you would have perpetual care, you would have memorial masses for the repose of someone's soul, and the souls being released from purgatory and all of that. But this is a different kind of memorial to the honor of the family, that it's not so much that you're going to gain a higher place in heaven or be released from purgatory, but this is just the devotion that people had to their deceased ancestors that would be expressed in monuments that we see here.
That generation, it was important, again, to have a monument of stone. Even if you couldn't afford a stone, you'd had something there with their name on it. It was important to the generation that that the name was there, and I think if you're put in stone and your name's in stone, that maybe that was important, so people would remember you. And again, depending on your financial situation, some have much larger, ostentatious. Like the one here, you have these little tiny monuments there, and a hunk of granite there that was certainly a lot of money and a lot of effort to put it in place.
There are times that when I walk through a cemetery, and obviously the first person that died in the family, and they've got the date of the death, and then they might have the wife or the child and no date of death. And sometimes, of course, the person isn't 140 years old, but it also reflects family disputes, because when I first got my driver's license and went to visit my father's grandparents' grave, I was horrified. There was no stone. They died in the 1940s. So I said to my father, "Dad, how can your grandparents not have a stone?" He said, "If you ask my one living uncle, they couldn't decide who was going to pay for it." So finally, finally, when the last uncle died, one of the cousins put up a stone. And of course, in some instances, these people are largely Yankees here, later immigrants. But when you have stones for immigrants like the famine Irish, some of these people had no idea how old they were. So the age on the stone may not reflect the reality of the people who are living there. buried there.
Oh yeah, it's great. Well, there's so many stories in cemeteries. Like there's one cemetery locally that all the Swedes were buried over the bank. It's like what? Because they were that popular, so they got the worst spots.
Yeah.
And there's enough place. Heck, I believe it's in Pittsburgh, where the guy was in his late 80s or maybe early 90s, and his 3 wives were buried around him, and his last wife was like 18. I said, oh, okay. So I mean, the stories you can come and I look at every stone there has a story, and some are very sad, and some are just fascinating when you get into it. When you start looking into it, and so you look at. I don't look at the cemeteries as sad places. I mean, cemeteries are made for the living; they're not made for the dead.
Right.
And when you go in there, and people who value their history, value their family, they will also have a stone there. I don't think you'll see that in the next couple of generations. I don't see it. I mean, we have green burials now. You have the expense is so much for a funeral. You say, why when I can have a cremation and I can dump them in the river or something? So, but which again will impact cemeteries nationwide, not just Evergreen. But it is a beautiful spot, though. You talk about, you see why the animals like to live there too. Nobody bothers you. I haven't run into there's a bear they're saying walking around through there. I haven't run into him yet, but it's again you can see the care that it had over the last couple centuries.
Yeah, and this, when you think of a generation, well, a century before actually, when people were buried in churchyards or small plots, and the early Puritan gravestones were really quite morbid. They would have the skull and crossbones and the angels, but this is a much more euphemistic reflection of death in a way that's soothing and comforting. And I think of the great poem that I used to teach by William Cullen Bryant called Thanatopsis, which is a view of death. And at the end of the poem, and again, I'm going by memory here, he said, "So when the final shroud comes, walk not like a quarry slave at night, but wrap thy cloak around me like laying down to a pleasant sleep." And I think that is really what we see reflected here in the rather calming presence of many of these stones.
And then you have the other extreme, which which is not in Evergreen, with the Puritan in that era, where it says, "No, reader beware, as you walk by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you shall be. Prepare for death and follow me." I mean, that's a real, it makes me feel great. You don't see that in Evergreen. That's not the vibe. But it's certainly, again, that's generational. Back then, death was so prevalent in everything. And now, prepare for death and follow me, because it really makes you feel good all over, But
so I wonder how many, so let's say the peak of burials here might have been as the Civil War folks started to die off. Just think of how many carvers, monument folks were employed to put up all of these stones.
Oh, it was an industry, and these are obviously are modern, but the other ones you had to have somebody with a wagon and horses and a block and tackle. That was their job to do this. The quarrymen in West Rutland and Proctor. It was an industry, not just with the monuments, but for the marble around. No, we call the Marble Valley for a reason.
Right.
But it's certainly what the cemetery business was a business, and it still is. But it's one of those businesses that's not as busy as it was back in the 1890s.
Tom, our time is just about run out. A fast trip like it was by car here. Thank you for being our guest, and perhaps what we could do as an end slide, we could put the mailing address of the cemetery, and if people would like to contribute, or perhaps we could find a way for folks to contact you who wish to volunteer to help with the cemetery.
We do have the board does have an address, and I'm not quite sure what it is because we're relatively new. But they can certainly contact me. All my information is in the city, on the city cemetery commissioner, and you can contact me through that, and I'll be happy to talk to you. And if you wish to make donations, you can send it right to the Evergreen Cemetery Association on Route 4, and I'm sure it'll get to us, or you can send it right to me, and I'll make sure it gets there.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.